Thank you, Everett. Good morning. Like Amos said, we just had a gospel meeting last weekend, and what a blessing that was to have here and to be a part of. Dr. McClarty talked frequently about his preaching heroes. He is one of my preaching heroes, so it was really good for me to have him here. I have been fired up this whole week, and I'm really excited to be here and to share a lesson with you this morning. Be turning in your Bibles to 1 Chronicles chapter 21. We'll be reading from there in just a little while. 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Have you ever heard of the expression, flying too close to the sun? The expression comes from a particular story within Greek mythology. And I'm not an expert on Greek mythology. I don't usually read myths. But I was reading a little bit about this, and the way the story goes is there's a Greek god named Daedalus, I think is how you pronounce that, I don't know. And he has a son named Icarus, and they're trapped in this labyrinth. And in order for them to escape, they build wings. They build wings out of, among other things, feathers and beeswax, so that they can fly out of the labyrinth. You can see the mythology involved in this. This is something that probably would never happen. So Icarus is about to fly out of the labyrinth, but before he does, his father warns him to not fly either too low to the water, so that the water wouldn't soak up the feathers, and also to not fly too close to the sun, so that the sun wouldn't melt the wax. Well, to make a long story short, Icarus flies too close to the sun, and his wings melt, and he ends up inevitably being plunged down from the sky into the sea, and he drowns. This is the story in Greek mythology that gave birth to this idiom of sorts, the idea of flying too close to the sun. The idea of the expression, in keeping with the story of Icarus, it is a cautionary tale, and it is to not place excessive confidence in one's self, or to be reckless in things, or to have perhaps even contempt on advice from other people, or even criticism from other people, or even to just ignore that advice altogether. It seems that perhaps this is part of what was going on with King David when we come to 1 Chronicles chapter 21. In these last few lessons in this series of 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, but we've been in 1 Chronicles, we looked most recently at 1 Chronicles chapter 17. And it's in that chapter. This is one of the most important chapters in the entirety of the Bible, along with its parallel in 2 Samuel 7. Because this chapter, 1 Chronicles 17, is the chapter where God makes a promise to David. The promise that David would have a seed who would sit on the throne forever. And so this chapter is what you would consider to be the high point of the narrative of King David, especially as we go through the book of Chronicles. God has promised to build David a house, and that refers again to a dynasty on the throne, a seed that would come, a son of David who would sit on the throne and whose kingdom would be established forever. We understand that that promise ultimately is referring to and is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And so this is the high point of Chronicles, and it's the high point as we look through the narrative of King David throughout this book. And yet, after that chapter, after chapter 17, things still remain pretty good. From chapters 18 to chapter 20 of 1 Chronicles, which we're not going to read for the sake of time, but in these chapters, we read of victory after victory after victory for David and for Israel. And he continues to defeat enemy after enemy, such as the Philistines, or the Moabites, or the Ammonites, or the Syrians. These are the ones that David and Israel beat time after time throughout these few chapters. And so you could say that things are going pretty well for David and for Israel. Perhaps things have been going a little too well. Perhaps David is flying a little too close to the sun. This is the immediate context behind what we read when we come to 1 Chronicles chapter 21. And it's interesting as you look through this how things have been going so well for David. And you could even go further back to chapter 16 of 1 Chronicles when they successfully bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. There was the failed attempt previously. That's the story of Uzzah. We looked at that previously. But they eventually do bring the Ark to Jerusalem. And then you have the promise of chapter 17. And you have all these victories in chapters 18 through 20. So things have been going very, very well for David and consequently also for Israel. But all of that will come to a screeching halt as we get into 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Read with me, if you will, 1 Chronicles 21. We'll read the first 14 verses to start. Then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. So David said to Joab and the commanders of the army, "Go, number Israel, from Beersheba to Dan, and bring me a report, that I may know their number." But Joab said, "May the Lord add to his people 100 times as many as they are. Are they not, my lord the king, all of them my lord's servants? Why then should my lord require this? Why should it be a cause of guilt for Israel?" But the king's word prevailed against Joab. And so Joab departed and went throughout all Israel and came back to Jerusalem. And Joab gave the sum of the numbering of the people to David. In all Israel there were 1,100,000 men who drew the sword. And in Judah 470,000 who drew the sword. But he did not include Levi and Benjamin in the numbering, for the king's command was abhorrent to Joab. But God was displeased with this thing, and he struck Israel. And David said to God, "I have sinned greatly in that I have done this thing. But now, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I've acted very foolishly." And the Lord spoke to Gad, David's seer, saying, "Go and say to David, thus says the Lord, 3 things I offer you. Choose one of them, that I may do it to you." And so Gad came to David and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, choose what you will. Either 3 years of famine, or 3 months of devastation by your foes, while the sword of your enemies overtakes you, or else 3 days of the sword of the Lord, pestilence on the land, with the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the territory of Israel. Now decide what answer I shall return to him who sent me." And then David said to Gad, "I am in great distress. Let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is very great. But do not let me fall into the hand of man." So the Lord sent a pestilence on Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell. You read that story, and that seems troubling. I think that's probably an understatement. All of this begins in verse 1, where we read there that Satan stood against Israel, and he incited David to number Israel. Anytime that Satan is mentioned in the Bible, as in this instance, it's worth us looking at. The word that is used in the original Hebrew language is literally Satan, and it literally means adversary or accuser, and is even translated as such sometimes in our Bible. You have the Hebrew word Satan, oftentimes used as adversary or accuser. But here in Chronicles, as also is the case in the book of Job and in the prophecy of Zechariah, we have the proper name, Satan. And the definition of his name is fitting, because he is our adversary. He is our enemy. And he is our accuser, as we see him doing to the high priest Joshua in Zechariah's prophecy. particularly what we see Satan doing here, in our context here in 1 Chronicles 21, where we are reading from right now, as he's standing against Israel, he is inciting David. Satan is against Israel, and what that means is he wants them to fail. He wants them to fall. He sees the success that they're having, and he wants that to come to an end. And so he's going to incite David, their king, to do something that he shouldn't do. To do something that's going to end very badly. To do something that not only will end badly, but will end in destruction. So just what could this be? Well, as the writer says, he incites David to number Israel. That is, to take up a census, as we would think of it, of how many people there are, to number them. Well, it doesn't seem like much. What could be the big deal about going and numbering Israel? Isn't it good to keep record of how many people there are? After all, we keep censuses still today. So what is the problem with this? Well, unfortunately, the writer does not go into detail about just what it is that's wrong about this. But we can read between the lines as to why this would be the wrong thing to do. Firstly, we can know indeed that this is wrong because it is Satan who is inciting it to happen. Anytime the evil one incites us to do something, it's the wrong thing to do. But then when you read this account and you read how it all unfolds, it becomes apparent that this isn't just a record-keeping census. Rather, this is a military census. You can tell based on, for one, who David sends to carry out the census. He doesn't send some government worker in his office or anything like that. He sends Joab. Joab being David's chief military man. And he also sends the other commanders of the army. And later on, when Joab comes back and he reports to David, notice what he says in verse 5. He says, "In all Israel there were 1,100,000 men who drew the sword. And again, in Judah, 470,000 who drew the sword." He gives that qualifier. These are the ones he's numbering. Men who can draw the sword. The connotation behind this, then, would be that David is incited by Satan to value his military, not based on if the Lord is on his side or not, but rather based on the number of men that he has. Not based on if the Lord is there, but based on the firepower that he thinks he might have. And given the context of this, given all of the military victories that you can read of in chapters 18 through 20, this seems likely to be at least part of, if not the reason why this is so wrong to have done. But regardless of why this is wrong, we can see that this is wrong. We can see that this is wrong in part because even Joab, as he's going about this, warns David that this is not the right thing to be doing. In his response to David, after David gives him this command, he says in verse 3, "Why then should my Lord require this? Why should it be a cause of guilt on Israel?" He knew, Joab did, from the minute that David gave this command, that this was the wrong thing to be doing, and that this would bring guilt upon Israel. And even as he's going and he's conducting the census, we read in verse 6 that he doesn't include in the numbers the tribes of Benjamin or the tribe of Levi. Because, as the writer puts it, the king's command was abhorrent to Joab. Joab felt pretty strongly about this, that this is the wrong thing to do. This was abhorrent. That's a strong word. He hated this command. And yet David as king prevailed, and Joab does as he's told. And so for whatever reason it might be, despite not having Joab's support, you have David, who, keep in mind, we understand is a man described as being after God's own heart. And yet here, in this instance, he allows himself to be incited by Satan. And he does as Satan would have him to do. And when we come to verse 7 of this chapter, we see that God was displeased with this thing. And so he strikes Israel. And what happens next is an intriguing thing between David and God. As you read through the stories of David in the Bible, it is abundantly clear that David and God have a pretty special relationship together, despite David's shortcomings, as we read here. And in verse 8 we read that David takes responsibility for what has happened. He says, I have sinned greatly in that I have done this thing. This perhaps gives us some insight that maybe David knew that this was the wrong thing to do all along. Sometimes in the moment we know something is wrong and we just don't care and we do it anyway because that's what we want to do, or that's what we're incited to do. But despite David taking this responsibility, as we read in verse 8, his actions have consequences. And his consequences, notice, they don't just affect him, but these actions affect all of Israel. Starting in verse 10, through Gad, who is David's seer, God offers David 3 choices as to what these consequences will be. First, there's the option of 3 years of famine. Second is the option of 3 months of devastation by his foes. And the third option is 3 days of the sword of the Lord, as well as pestilence on the land, as well as the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all of the territory of Israel. Well, if you're David, if you're the king of Israel, if you yourself are responsible for this action, and if you see that all of these options greatly affect you and your people, how can you possibly choose between these options? It's not like one looks particularly better than the other. You sacrifice severity for length of time, so how can you possibly choose? Well, David doesn't choose between those options. Instead, he chooses to put it in God's hands. In verse 13, David tells Gad, I am in great distress. I think that's probably an understatement. And he says, let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is very great. But don't let me fall into the hand of men. And so David gives this to God. He puts it in God's hands. And God evidently chooses that third option, because we read in verse 14 that the Lord sends pestilence upon Israel, and 70,000 men fall. But he's not done yet. Because look at the first part of verse 15. It says, and God sent the angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. That pestilence that we just read in verse 14, it's taking care of 70,000 men in Israel. And now God is sending the angel to come and to destroy Jerusalem entirely. To this point in this chapter, as we've been going through this chapter, it's been entirely bad. David, he does something he shouldn't have done. He's warned about it by Joab, but he doesn't listen. He insists on it because he's incited by Satan. And despite now the sorrow that David is feeling, despite knowing that it was wrong, and despite even being willing to take accountability for it, his actions still have consequences. And those consequences are now unfolding as we read through these pages together. So that raises the question, what good is there in this chapter? When are we going to get to the good part? What good news, what gospel is there in this? Well, the answer to that question actually lies in the rest of the chapter. Join me back, if you will, in chapter 21 of 1 Chronicles, and we'll read a few more verses, picking up in verse 15. It says again, God sent the angel to Jerusalem to destroy it, but As he was about to destroy it, the Lord saw, and he relented from the calamity. And he said to the angel who was working destruction, "It is enough. Now stay your hand." And the angel of the Lord was standing by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And David lifted his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord standing between earth and heaven, and in his hand a drawn sword stretched out over Jerusalem. Then David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell upon their faces. And David said to God, "Was it not I who gave command to number the people? It is I who have sinned and done great evil. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand, O Lord my God, be against me and against my father's house. But do not let the plague be on your people." If you've been looking for the good news in this chapter, here it is. Although we read of 70,000 men of Israel having fallen, and although things seem to be as bad as they possibly could be, despite how good things were just before, and although they certainly deserve much more, and God has even said much more would happen, despite all of this, we read in verse 15 that as that angel is about to destroy Jerusalem, sword drawn and all, the Lord saw. How wonderful it is to know that we serve a God who is not blind, but a God who sees. And not only who sees, but is attentive and watchful and aware. And when the Lord saw, it says that he relented from the calamity. This word that's used, that's translated as relented, is an interesting word. Most modern English versions of the Bible will use that word relented. If you have a New King James or an NIV, it uses the same word. It's relented. But if you have, say, a New American Standard, instead of saying relented, it says that he was sorry over the calamity. And better yet, if you are old school and you have an old American Standard, it says that he repented him of the evil. What's really interesting about this word, that the word that's translated either as relented or was sorry over or repented, this is the same word that's used in Genesis chapter 6, where it says that the Lord regretted that he had made man. It's also the same word that's used in 1 Samuel 15, where it says that God regretted making Saul king. So what does being sorry or having regret and relenting, what do all of these ideas have in common? How can one word have all of this nuance to it, and how in the world can we understand it? When you study the context of each of these instances, both here in Chronicles as well as in 1 Samuel 15 and in Genesis 6, all three of them carry behind them the idea, in some way or another, that enough is enough. In the case of Genesis chapter 6, the Lord had seen that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intention of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. That's very emphatic language. And so God said, enough is enough. And he sends the flood. In the case of 1 Samuel 15, Saul's iniquity, like we studied back in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, his iniquity had led to God resolving that Saul could no longer be king over Israel. And so God is going to put someone else in as king. That someone happened to be King David. And we see that God would make an end of Saul's reign. God said, enough is enough. And in this case, in 1 Chronicles 21, the Lord saw. He saw what was going on. He saw the pestilence that Israel was going through. He saw the 70,000 men that had fallen. And he saw David's sorrow over what he had done. And so here, God says, enough is enough. God relents the calamity. And he tells the angel, it is enough. Now stay your hand. And as that angel is standing there by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, David lifts his eyes and he sees this. He sees the angel standing there between earth and heaven. And this must have been horrific for David to have seen. Because not only does he see that angel standing there, but he sees in his hand a sword that is drawn and that is ready to be used. David realizes how severe this must be. Because not only have 70,000 of his men already fallen, but that angel is ready to do exponentially more damage. And so David does what anyone would have likely done. He, along with the elders, while being clothed in sackcloth, showing their humility, they fall on their faces. In that moment, David, as the king of Israel, he is completely and utterly powerless over the fate of his people. Their fate now rests in God's hands. And so David, knowing this, says to God, was it not I who commanded this to be done? Is it not I who have sinned and done this great evil? But these sheep, what have they done? And he goes on to say, please let your hand, O Lord my God, be against me and against my father's house. But do not let the plague be on your people. Here we see David take full responsibility for what he has done. He doesn't blame Joab, the one who actually went and carried out the census. He's just doing as he's told. Nor does he blame Satan, the one who incited him to do this. David instead takes all of the responsibility. And as the one who is fully responsible, David is also willing to take all of the punishment. And after this, David is commanded to go and to raise an altar to the Lord on that very threshing floor of Ornan where that angel is standing. And with no other choice, David does as he's told. He goes and he pays full price for the side of the threshing floor, as well as the animals that Ornan was willing to give him. And David goes and he builds that altar. And he presents burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And as it says in verse 26, when David called on the Lord answered him with fire from heaven upon the altar of the burnt offering. Then God commands the angel, and the angel puts his sword back in its sheath. This particular story, the story here of David building the altar on the threshing floor and so on, this is the story of how David chooses where the temple of the Lord is going to be built. And again, he's not the one who builds it, but he makes a lot of the plans for it. And in fact, the rest of 1 Chronicles more or less tells that story of David planning for the building of the temple. But more importantly, this particular story, 1 Chronicles 21, it is the story of how the Lord relented, bringing the calamity that David and Israel rightly deserved. David's actions certainly had consequences. And we see the cost that came with those actions. The cost not only of those 70,000 men who fell, but also the price that David paid for that threshing floor, and the price that David paid for the animals to be used in that offering. But those consequences were going to be, and perhaps should have been, much more severe than they were. And yet, the Lord saw, and the Lord relented. And just as David said, when choosing the consequences for his sins, he gets the three options. The Lord had mercy on them all. So what does this story have to do with us? Well, when you think about it, things today aren't all that different than they were back then. For example, just as David did and just as Israel did, we have an adversary or an accuser who stands against us today. In fact, not only do we have an adversary, but it's the same adversary that stood against Israel and incited David back then. Just as he did with Israel, Satan still stands against God's people today. Think about what the Apostle Peter tells us in 1 Peter 5 and verse 8, that our adversary, that's the word he uses, the devil, he prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Just as he was against Israel then, he's after you, he's after me, he's after all of us. He wants us to fall away. And so he tempts us, and he does so in opportune times. Like we read in Luke 4 and verse 13, after the devil tempts Jesus, as Luke tells it there, he departs Jesus until an opportune time. Our adversary looks for opportune times in all of us. And he tempts us. And he incites us to do things that we shouldn't do, things that are destructive, things that are to our detriment. He does that to us just as he did to David in this story. And unfortunately, many times, we succumb to those temptations. Many times, despite us knowing that something is wrong, we do those things that we're not supposed to be doing, that we have no business doing. Many times we give in to those temptations and we sin. We transgress against God. And just as it was for David in this story, our sin, our actions, they have consequences. Just like everything we do in life has consequences. For example, if you are one who frequently engages in drunkenness, some of the consequences of that particular sin are things that could happen, such as alcohol poisoning or liver disease. All of that on top of the things that you might do while you're under the influence. But perhaps most notable, and we could go on and on about the various consequences of various sins, but most notable is the fact that all sin has at least one shared consequence: death. In Romans 6 and verse 23, the Apostle Paul tells us that there is a penalty or a wage for our sin. And that wage is death. Death being eternal separation from God. But despite all of us being deserving of that death, despite all of us having sin and falling short of the glory of God, just as God did to David back then, and just as he did for Israel, the Lord sees, and he relents. He relents by offering us salvation. Despite deserving that death, he offers us salvation. He offers us a way out of that wrath that we rightly deserve. And he does so through the sacrifice of his one and only Son, Jesus, the Christ. The wage of our sin, what we have earned from our sin, is death. And Jesus, in going to the cross, in being crucified there, he dies the death that we deserve in our place. We read in our scripture reading this morning from Ephesians 2, starting in verse 4, that God, who is rich in mercy, mercy being, of course, the withholding of wrath, that's the literal meaning of that word, being rich in mercy, because of the great love he has for us, which he has loved us with, even when we were dead in our trespasses. There's that death. Even when we were dead in our trespasses, even when we were lost in our sin and lost from God, he has made us alive together with Christ. God has offered us a way out. God has relented. But just as David did, we also have an obligation to him, an obligation to respond in faith. After all, God sent Jesus to the cross to be the atoning sacrifice for all of our sin. But not everyone receives that. So the question then is, how do we receive it? Well, we receive it by responding in faith. In David's case, God instructed him to build an altar for him on that threshing floor of Ornan and to make offerings to him. In our case today, when it comes to accepting God's free gift of salvation, something we do not earn and cannot earn, we receive it by responding in faith and by obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ, culminated in being buried in the watery grave of baptism. In doing so, joining in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. For those who respond in faith, just as David responded in faith in building that altar and making those offerings, God will see, and God will relent. This morning, there are many of us here who are dealing with the consequences of our sin. Our sin does indeed have consequences, no matter what that sin might be. But just because we deal with the consequences of those sins, and we may deal with those consequences for the rest of our lives, but just because we deal with those consequences, that doesn't mean that sin cannot be forgiven. For David, even though his sin had consequences, and even though those consequences were pretty severe, God saw, and He relented. And today He offers to do the same for us if we respond in faith by obeying the gospel. If you have not obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ this morning, I hope that you'll make the decision to do that. I hope that you'll respond in faith to what God has done in sending Jesus to the cross. God sees, and God relents for those who've been washed in the blood of His Son. If you're subject to the Lord's invitation for salvation this morning, or if you have any other spiritual needs, be it prayer, be it repentance, whatever else, won't you respond now as we stand and as we sing?